For those listening today, my guest is Adam Zientek. Adam, thank you so much for being here. It's an honor. Your research was captivating, and it's the reason I want to talk to you today. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Sean. I'm happy to be here.
So Adam, you're on the Pacific Coast. You're in
That's right.
Los Angeles or San Francisco? You're in.
I'm in Davis, which is about
Okay,
15 miles southwest of Sacramento.
perfect. Well, the point is, it's 9 a.m. there. It's 12 p.m. here. We got a little bottle of wine here. You got permission here to open a bottle. What are you drinking for this conversation?
Yeah, so I'm drinking an Altesse, a wine that I've never had before from, I think from Savoy in France, and it's a nice dry kind of minerally white.
Okay,
I
okay.
figured it would be a good breakfast wine.
I got a good lunch slash I guess brunch wine as well. So you got some old world white. I'm bringing new world white here with Groth. Not sure if you're familiar. Groth Napa Valley Sauvignon Blanc from the 2023 vintage. Also, just a crisp, minerally, fruit driven white. And I'm really excited to dive into this because it is a very hot, humid day in Florida. So there we go. Here we
All
go,
right,
Adam.
cheers.
Cheers to the drink that was called one of the fathers of victory for World War
Yep,
One, right?
the Père de la Victoire. That's exactly right.
Of
Cheers.
course. Cheers. 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 Put this down here. Adam, so I want to talk about a really special book that you wrote, and the back of the book really details it perfectly. So I just want to talk about it here. It says, beginning in the fall of 1914, every French soldier on the Western Front received a daily ration of wine from the army. At first, it was a modest quarter liter, but by 1917, it had increased to the equivalent of a full bottle each day. The wine ration was intended to sustain morale in the trenches, making the men more willing to endure suffering and boredom. The army also supplied soldiers with doses of distilled alcohol just before attacks to increase their ferocity and fearlessness. This strategic distribution of alcohol was a defining feature of French soldiers' experiences of the war and amounted to an experimental policy of intoxicating soldiers for military purposes. So I didn't know that this was happening during World War One. Like we were talking, that this was a methodical approach, right, to bringing
Hmm.
wine into the trenches and it being honestly a unifying factor within those trenches, within those groups of soldiers before attacks, during attacks, and after the war as well. So we're going to
Hmm.
dive into that. And you, Adam, just a bit of a background. You studied history at the University of California, Berkeley, and then attended Stanford University, where you got your master's and PhD in history. So history is your specialty, obviously here,
That's right. Well,
and
but
yeah.
as an undergraduate, I also I studied molecular neurobiology.
Okay, and that's
So
yeah.
I was intending to be a doctor, but it turns out I'm much better at history than I am at science.
But you're combining both of them here because you have a very specific interest in the history of military medicine and psychiatry and the history of alcohol and drugs when it relates to warfare and history as well. Is that correct?
That's exactly right.
Got it. And one thing that's very interesting before we dive in, the book says that as of September 1915, between 20 to 35% of every winemaker's harvest became the army's. It gave
Hmm.
courage, patriotic faith, and energy, and was later hailed, as we said, as one of the fathers of the victory in France. Pinard, according to one soldier, and Pinard meaning wine here, perfumed meals in the trenches, giving men appetite and allowing them to eat while the smell of death and decay lay over them like fog. I mean, some of these quotes in the book are very they're very descriptive, but they're very accurate. You kind of have a sense of what was going on there. So what take me back to how'd you get to starting to write this award-winning book? Where did it start?
Okay, well that's a great question, Sean. Thanks for asking it. I came into graduate school intending to study the French Algerian War, which took place between 1954 and 1962 and was characterized by rampant war crimes and crimes against humanity on both sides. So, what I wanted to do in graduate school was study the high intellectual French response to the issue of the use of terror. So I wrote my master's thesis on this subject. And at the end of my second year of graduate school, I was helpfully told that if I wanted to pursue a career as a historian of French Algeria, I would have to learn Arabic.
Mhm.
And that would take
You would have to learn how to
something like
what was that?
I'd have to learn Arabic.
Ah, okay.
So I'd have to go to Morocco for 3 years and learn Arabic, and I was not excited about the prospect of doing that.
Mhm.
So I had to fish around and find a new dissertation topic, which is a terrible position to be in when you're a third year PhD candidate. But I was slated to teach to TA a class in military history, and there was a 3 week long section on World War One. And while I was familiar with the history, I wasn't really familiar with the way armies actually worked, how they were organized, how they were supplied. And so I started reading. In particular, I read a lot of memoirs written by French, German, and British soldiers.
Mhm.
And I noticed that people were just drinking all the time, all the time, in the trenches, when they were out of the trenches. Of course, when they were home on leave, it was a big party. And so I just started asking some basic questions. Like, where is this alcohol coming from? How much were they drinking? Isn't it against the rules? Did it affect the way that they fought? How did it influence their daily lives? And the most important question, of course, has anybody else ever written about this subject before? Because you have to find something relatively
Yeah,
new.
that's with any idea. It's like, has anyone ever done this before? And was the answer no, I'm assuming?
And the answer was there are occasional references.
Yeah.
The first reference I saw was in a book from the late 1960s, but it was just a page. And so I was able to find this gap in the historiography, which, as far as I'm concerned, was a yawning gap, because as we'll discuss later, wine consumption was just so central to the experience and the identity of French soldiers during the First World War. So I went abroad on a fact-finding mission to the military archives in France, which are just outside of Paris in Vincennes. They're actually in a literal castle. You have to go over a moat to get there. It's pretty cool.
That's a great
And
way to
I
get to
found,
your study room.
yeah, and I found just a wealth of material that, so far as I could tell, nobody had really looked at, or at least not looked at in this way. So
Yeah.
I spent about 2 years doing research in France, reconstructing the logistical apparatus, finding where wine was purchased, and then using memoirs, journals, interviews, novels to fill in the gaps about what the experience of drinking was like.
Yeah, and the result right here is the book A Thirst for Wine and War, and that research, there's so much detail as to who distributes the wine, right? How like you were saying, how does the wine get to the trenches right in front of where Germany is firing artilleries? You literally have people, like you had written in the book, right, walking 12 kilometers or like even more with just heavy sets of wine while bombs are falling. That's how
Right,
important
that's right.
that's how important wine was in the war. Was wine important in previous wars or alcohol in general, or was World War One where you really saw it on a magnificent scale?
So I think the answer to that is both.
Mhm.
Alcohol consumption and soldiering have been part of Western civilization since basically alcohol was invented, right? And a lot of this has to do with the fact that battle, in particular, is a fundamentally different and liminal experience from ordinary life, and that it is characterized almost always by fear and tension. And so alcohol has played a role throughout history in helping soldiers overcome that fear and tension.
Mhm.
Now, usually up until the First World War in the West, battles were quite short. With the exception of sieges, battles could be a day, a couple of hours, maybe 2 or 3 days at the most. So the question of alcohol consumption was drinking before battle in a kind of immediate way. But
Yeah.
what's different about the First World War is that the battle basically never ends, right? It's 4.5 years long, where these guys are in the trenches, often under fire, especially if they're in a hot sector, and anchoring these soldiers into place, because the front doesn't move very much. Just maybe a kilometer here or there every once in a while, allows for essentially what I call in the book a great big straw to be built.
A great
That the
big
French
what? Sorry,
army,
what was that? A great big.
a great big straw.
Okay.
So the army sucks up alcohol from all over France, all over the Iberian Peninsula, uh, Algeria. This really kickstarts the Algerian wine industry. They send purchasing agents to Argentina, to Brazil. There's attempts to get contracts in California and even Australia, although I don't know how that would have possibly worked. Right?
Yeah.
There's a kind of infinite thirst for wine.
And
And
how
what
we're talking about like over 2 million soldiers, right? A lot of mouths to feed here, right?
Yeah, it's about 2.75 million French soldiers on the Western Front.
That's a crazy amount of wine. They went on a global search for wine, although France was supplying almost all of it. I'm assuming.
France is supplying the vast majority, but um, a kind of thumbnail estimate is that the French army is drinking something like a quarter of the world production of wine between 1914 and 1918. The vast majority of France's production, and France is produces more wine than anybody else. Um, it is, yeah, it's like this. If you can imagine, it's like a huge funnel, right, pointing out to the world, and the wine is just getting funneled down into this narrow tube and injected directly into the Western Front.
Yeah, so the industry, I'm assuming this was good for the industry, right? At the time of when the war started, I think you write that the industry was not doing very well. Demand was not as high as they would like it to be, and all of a sudden, this must have been good.
The harvest of 1914 is the second largest in French history up to that point. It's a bumper harvest. It's something like 67, 68 million hectoliters. And the war starts, and all the heavy drinkers basically uh, are locked away at the front. All the men between the ages of 19 and 45 or so are conscripted into the army
Mhm.
and are either in the trenches or in the rear, helping with logistics and supply. So the basically all the consumers uh, are in the army, and the wine producers hit on this idea, which is to convince the army to adopt a wine ration, because this will allow them to sell their wine, hopefully at good prices, and not go under during the war.
Mhm.
So all the consumers are trapped in the same place. The winemakers think this is an incredible opportunity, not only to sell wine to the army, but also to train a generation or two generations of French men to become daily wine drinkers.
Mhm.
Because at this time, wine in France is not just a drink. It has special biological and medical and almost spiritual properties.
Yeah.
Right? It's a symbol of France. It's a symbol of the blood of the soil. And so there is this enormous cultural apparatus that comes along with wine in the French army. So these guys launched what's called the Vin à Soldat campaign, the Wine for Soldiers public relations campaign,
Mhm.
in about October of 1914. Uh, and this is a crucial time in the history of the war, because by October 1914, the trench system is more or less completed. The war of movement is over. But the French feel obligated, for reasons of honor, to drive the Germans out of their country. And so it's expected, and there really are, in the winter of 1914, 1915, a series of large offensives,
Mhm.
brutal, extremely costly offensives. And the idea that the winemakers pitch is essentially in order to power French soldiers through this trying period where they have to fight and beat the Germans, wine will be an invaluable tool. They treat it refer to it later, almost like a munition, right?
Yeah,
They call it
exactly.
an energizing munition for the body.
It was a unifying force at the front of the war, because what was interesting is at the rear front, behind enemy lines, miles and miles away from where the bombs were falling, that's where you had most of the prohibitive alcohol laws. Yet in the trenches, it was like free for all, wine, 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 wine. So in the most dangerous part of the war, the trenches, right in front of the where the Germans were fighting, where they had to get out of the trenches and run and gain ground, that's where the laws were more loose. So it's kind of like the opposite of what you would think, right?
Right. Right, exactly. So what happens is in the book I argue that the French develop what I call a psychotropic regime at the front. And you're exactly right that there's a kind of gradient from the rear front, which is a couple of miles to many miles behind the front. There are relatively strict prohibitions, especially on distilled alcohol consumption. But at the front, in the trenches, so far as I could tell, there's basically no limits on how much men can drink, so long as they can bring it up themselves, they can afford it. So they do get an official ration from the army, right? Which starts out relatively stingy at a quarter liter per wine of wine per man per day. So, um, what's that come to? Like two standard drinks by the
Yeah,
British measure, something like
I
that.
think I'm at a quarter liter right now, I guess. Very small amount.
Right, just enough so you could feel it. There is a kind of physical sensation, but not really enough to intoxicate people. But by the end of the war, it is three-quarters of a liter per man per day officially, and soldiers tend to get more because they're allowed to purchase wine and bring it up to the front in their own wine canteens, which are called bidons. I actually have one right here
Oh, let's see it.
that was dug up
Was that like
in
their
a god awful
decanter?
field somewhere.
Oh my, that's like their bottle right there.
Yeah, that's a real one. And I found this too. This is really cool. So you were mentioning that wine becomes a symbol of essentially the moral unity of the French soldiers, right? It is the blood of France. It binds them all together. And this little bidon becomes the symbol of French soldiers. Now this little thing here is the cup, a quarter liter cup. It's called the quart. And this is the bidon. And you can see it's a little hollow. So this was almost like kind of like an advent calendar. 30 days before you would be conscripted, your family would get you this. And originally there were sheets of paper on the inside, starting at 30 and counting down backwards to the time that you would be inducted into the French army.
Hmm.
So this was like a little device, like welcome. By the time you get to zero, this is going to be your life. You're going to have a bidon on your hip, and you're going to be in the trenches. So there were two versions of these canteens. There was a 2 liter version made especially for carrying wine, and a 1 liter version, which was supposed to be for water, but which everybody used for wine anyway. And soldiers had this neat trick, which is they would dump some of the powder out from a cartridge and create a blank, and then fire the cartridge into the mouth of the canteen, which would expand it. So
Oh
they'd
my
be able to
God.
cheat. They'd be able to cheat the wine sellers
Okay.
when they went up and paid for a liter of wine. They get a liter and a half.
Basically, what you're saying is they would have this empty thing. They would shoot a cartridge into it. This would expand so they could get more wine.
That's exactly right.
The innovation here is absolutely incredible. I love it. I love it. They wanted, but the other thing is the soldiers actually over time you wrote became kind of sticklers for quality. You mentioned that in August of 1915 there was a huge drop in wine supplied to the front, and that had to do with was the quality not accepted there?
So that's a great question. That wine purchasing, the Army's wine purchasing up until August 1915 is incredibly haphazard and unprofessional. They're essentially sending out agents to local wine cellars and having them negotiate individually with all of these wine cellars and then arrange for the stuff to be brought up to the front. And this leads to a lot of fraud
Okay.
and quite a bit of vinage and moulage, right? Like adding extra alcohol in or watering it down. And the wine industry essentially can't meet the demand for the army. So it's right about this point, in the summer of 1915, that the army essentially half nationalizes the French wine industry and reserves something like 30% of every wine harvest from every wine cellar for the army. That'll be purchased at set rates and will be tested at an enological laboratory in Montpellier, tested for alcohol content, adulteration, and taste. So the wine actually gets better as the war goes on.
Exactly. There's
Uh,
more basically regulation on it, I guess.
yes, yes.
Okay.
So it's not terrible. It's not terrible. It's approximately equivalent to what these guys would be drinking in their ordinary lives. Now, obviously, it's somewhat roughly handled, and
Yeah.
they're drinking it out of metal containers, so it's it has a certain kind of
Exactly, but
um,
but it also it became sort of in ancient Roman times, right? They would drink alcohol over water because the water would be poisonous. Like here, wine almost you couldn't really drink water in the trenches, right? Wine also became like sustenance, food.
so wine was considered a source of hydration. Although there were attempts, reasonably successful attempts, to bring water up. I found some evidence in the archives of these machines that kind of chlorinated the water to make it safe to drink. But soldiers relied on the alcohol for hydration and also for calories. That one of the reasons why wine is integrated into the ration schedules. I mean, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons why is to provide an extra 400 to 600 calories a day.
Hmm.
And the calories that French scientists talk about as coming from wine, they say are unique kinds of energy. That wine has the ability to help the blood carry oxygen.
Hmm.
It has the ability to help muscles repair themselves. It has the ability to recharge neurons because of its special electrical properties.
Yeah.
So it's not just an ordinary drink, right? It is a food, but it's also a kind of medicine. The medicine that treats the symptom of the trenches, right? Which I talk in my book is called the cafard, which in French means the cockroach. And so the cafard was like a sense of lassitude, depression, hopelessness that would often overtake soldiers in the trenches on the Western Front, right? Because you have to imagine their lives are pretty miserable.
Yeah.
It's mud and rats, crappy food, random death from above during battles, pure terror, anxiety. They're sleeping during the day on the ground in these muddy trenches or in funk holes. If they're lucky, they could go down into a dugout. And so the wine arriving is like the most important part of their day when the wine ration arrives in the trenches. It usually happens twice a day.
Okay.
And it becomes a very important morale building ritual. So you can imagine these soldiers in a trench uh, lining up to get their wine.
From the cook, right?
Yeah, well, if they're in the rear area, they get it from the cuistot, right? The cook, the
Okay.
legendary cook who's always defiled with fat and blood.
The guy to be friends with.
Yeah, he determines who gets how much wine. So he's a very powerful man in
Yeah.
the society of the trenches.
Yeah.
In the front, it's usually a corporal who distributes the wine. But everybody's got to line up, right? Because the trenches are not very wide. And so what you end up with is a kind of facsimile of the sacrament of communion.
The unifying force of it. It would unify groups together. And I want to combine two things that you were saying: the cafard, right, the cockroach, the colonial blues is another term
Exactly.
that someone else says. So it lifted morale, right? So did it have any influence on winning battles because it improves your courageousness? Obviously, it shrinks your fear levels, so when you have to go up and capture ground, how did it work in the body to win battles?
Oh, that's a great question. So the moments before a battle in the First World War are full of incredible fear and tension, because typically these battles begin with a preparatory artillery bombardment that could last. It could be a hurricane bombardment that lasts 15 minutes, an hour or so. But at some of the large set piece battles like the Somme and the Chemin de Dam, the preparatory bombardment can last up to a week, and millions of shells are fired into the enemy positions with the goal of destroying their defenses, killing and stupefying the defenders. But this means that soldiers are brought up into their jumping off trenches hours, sometimes a day before the attack is scheduled to begin. And they sit there and they just count down the minutes, right, to a heure H, as you would call it in French, 0 hour.
Mhm.
And as this time counts down, the sense of fear and tension builds, right, to a kind of fever pitch.
Yeah.
And what this alcohol distribution does, wine but also distilled alcohol, the stuff they call Knoll that they often get before attacks.
Yeah.
It works both on the level of the body and on the level of culture, right? Because
Would Knoll be like a shot of alcohol? Would it be basically that in today's
yeah,
term?
it would be a shot, probably of a clear alcohol most of the time. That would be somewhere 60% ABV, so
Okay.
about 1.5 times as strong as an ordinary shot.
Oh, you're ready to run
And
in a fire after that.
right, and these guys would get 4 or 6 ounces of this stuff right before an attack, and so they definitely felt it. So the anxiolytic properties of alcohol have an effect kind of biochemically in reducing anxiety and dulling fear. But also what matters is the cultural context in which these guys are consuming, right? Because in particular, distilled alcohol, as I talk about in the book, is viewed as a profoundly dangerous drug in France. It's talked about, categorized, taxed in a completely different way than wine is.
They're like
And so
completely
when these
separate categories in terms of their cultural significance.
That's right. That wine is considered, at least as of the early 1900s, what's called a boisson hygiénique, a hygienical or health drink. It's categorized along with beer and cider as these boissons hygiéniques, whereas alcohol, distilled alcohol, is called alcool, which in French at this time refers specifically to distilled alcohol. Right? Wine is not an alcool. And this distilled alcohol makes its appearance in France relatively late, right around the 1870s, 1880s,
Yeah.
as a substitute for the wine consumption and production that craters during the phylloxera blight. And so it becomes associated with the burgeoning radical working classes who take to distilled alcohol with great relish because it is cheap, it is plentiful, and it is very powerful.
Yeah.
So when these French guys, these soldiers are getting this distilled alcohol before they attack, like they interpret the feeling of intoxication in a certain way. Right? This wonderful psychiatrist and theorist of drug and alcohol consumption named Howard Zinberg once wrote that you have to consider what he called the setting, and the drug set and setting, in determining how people experience and behave when they're intoxicated. Right, the
Mm.
drug meaning the pharmacological properties of the drug and the interoceptive sensations it produces. The set meaning the physical and social environment, or the set meaning the cultural assumptions and experiences that the drug taker or the drinker brings to the table, and the setting being the bigger environment in which they drink. And so, what I argue is that soldiers interpret their intoxication as the feeling of becoming violent, as the feeling of becoming murderous. And this is the way they describe it in their journals and their interviews and the like. They say, I drank and I became inhuman. I drank, I became a monster. I drank and I was full of bloodlust. Which is different than what they say when they drink wine. When they drink wine, they say, I felt as though I was part of this moral community. I spent time with my friends. I felt connected to France, because wine is obviously the French drink par excellence in French culture.
The blood of
Where
the
just
soil.
the blood of the
Literally,
soil.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, literally, that's what they say in their poems
A-
and their songs.
And I love how in this book, you don't only write about, all the research that you dive into, but you include a lot of poems that talk about, they don't say wine, they say Pinard or Pinard.
Right.
I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but the poems really express the emotional connection to wine, the community that was made through that, and the patriotic feeling that it gave from consuming something that meant so much to the soldiers.
No,
And it became a requirement basically for the army to
yeah,
have wine. It's like having
yeah,
guns. It was ammunition.
and and anybody who didn't drink any of the poilus, which is the French kind of term for a World War One soldier, it means hairy dude because they would grow out these big bushy beards.
Yeah.
Uh, Anybody who didn't drink wine was like a real odd bird, right? Like this, he was suspiciously un-French if he wasn't drinking the Pinot.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're right. I found so many poems and songs in this wonderful source that is almost unique to the First World War, called the
L
Trench Journal.
Exactly. And those I feel like maybe they were written in the trenches, the trench journals, but you also talk about a very important part of the wine community during the war called debits or debites, or are they
Debbie, yeah.
would they be wine bars or at the rear front? Or what is a debit here?
So a Debbie is basically like a licensed alcohol seller.
Okay.
Um,
Like a wine
so
shop, something like that. It would be a
yeah, where you can both drink inside and get stuff to go usually.
okay.
And these places dot the front like stars speckling the sky on a clear night. They are the front is divided essentially into to two parts, right? There's the active trenches, and then a couple of kilometers back, there are towns and villages where soldiers rotate out. Typically, in the French army, you spend 8 days in the front lines, 8 days or so in the support trenches, and 8 days in the rear.
Okay.
And the what these guys do in the rear is basically they go on the chasse au pinard, right? The Pinard hunt, and they go to these debits, which are typically run by like elderly people who have nowhere else to go and are deciding to profit off the war that's
Yeah.
victimized them.
Yeah.
And they sell wine at outrageous prices, of course.
I was gonna ask if there
But
was
this,
price gouging. This would be like an
oh my
example of
god,
yeah.
yeah. I mean, the what these soldiers are paying in the rear area is an order of magnitude bigger than what they were paying in their civilian lives before the war, like 10 times more.
Yeah.
But they're desperate for it, and they've got nothing else to do, really. They have their parades sometimes, exercises, but evenings are off. They're all at the debit, having having these these big, often big furniture busting parties.
Yeah. You say it was like a grounds for just for mutiny and syphilis. I think it was that's what you were saying, right? It was also just a lot of was it maybe a brothel? Was it also that in there as well, or no?
Some Yes, they were. Debits were often frequented by prostitutes.
Hmm.
Uh, Prostitution was very common in the French army during the First World War. It was like semi-official and semi-regulated, where of course there were different types of brothels, good ones for the officers, the red light one, blue light ones for the officers, red light
Yeah.
ones for the enlisted men. And there was this fear among French commanders
Hmm.
that too much alcohol consumption, particularly distilled alcohol consumption, would lead men to frequent prostitutes who would give them venereal diseases. They called it the péril vénérien, right?
Hmm.
The Venerean
Which would
peril.
obviously become a big problem on the battlefield and for
Oh, it's
conscription numbers.
it's a huge problem. In some months, more more soldiers, not only in the French army but the British and the American armies too, are invalided out of the front for venereal disease than they are for injuries on the battlefield.
Wow. Wow, interesting. So that's where kind of it started. You talk about later in the book how commanders had to kind of reel it back a little bit. They really had to be like, okay, listen, this is going to be army regulated now. This is over the years, basically, the consumption became more and more, and it also became a problem in the rear front, right?
Right.
On
So
the battlefield, it was fine, but on the rear front, you started getting these issues going on.
that's exactly right. So the year 1917 is a very difficult year for the Allied armies on the Western Front. Right, the British towards the end of the year fight in this atrocious battle, Passchendaele, which is maybe the most disgraceful battle of the entire First World War, which is really saying something. And the French fight in a battle that begins on April 16th, 1917, called the Nivelle Offensive or the Chemin de Dam or the Second Aim. The battle has three names. And the battle is just an absolute disaster for the French. They suffer the worst casualties that they had suffered since 1914. In a day or two, they get
Mhm.
160,000 casualties.
What 100
And
160,000 people dead in 2 days.
oh, not dead, but seriously injured or dead. Yeah,
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah, okay.
2 or 3 days. It's just an absolute massacre. These units lose 50, 60% of their effective fighting power
Mhm.
in a day or two. And many are end up stranded in no man's land for days at a time under shelling. It's this horrible experience. And what happens in the aftermath is that many of the units who take place or take part in this battle, and are ravaged by it are then rotated out to the rear areas for a break.
Yeah.
And they go to the debit, right? They go to the cafes, they go to the drinking spots, which essentially provide them with a shelter from command authority and surveillance. And they share their grievances. They discuss their disgust with the war. And often, once they get to a high enough point of intoxication, they spill out of the debit, they launch an anti-war protest, and they mutiny. So quite a few divisions mutiny between the end of May 1917 and through the summer into June. And so what happens in the aftermath of this battle then is that the army loses control of this system that it had created to try and generate certain kinds of experiences and emotions that were beneficial to the war effort. And it has to crack down quite profoundly on wine drinking in the rear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the wine drinking in the trenches, that was seen as like, if you take the wine away from the trenches, because one of the questions I had for you is, what, without wine, what would the war have looked like? What would these 4.5 years without wine, what do you think it would have looked like?
Oh my God, I have no idea.
Mm-hmm.
In the French case, uh, maybe it would have looked more like the Americans, right? So when the Americans arrive, they are all given a pamphlet that says, "Don't drink, don't fraternize with French women. It's very dangerous." So the American army, perhaps unsurprisingly,
Don't
considering
chill
it's
with the French. Is
1917,
that what they were saying?
yeah. Don't fraternize with the French. Stay away from the wine. Stay away from the debits and the brothels and the like. So the American army doesn't have an alcohol ration. The British army has a rum ration, and officers drink whiskey quite heavily.
Okay, so the British Army has a rum ration and whiskey. French had wine. Germany had beer, right? Sorry, I'm just trying to understand which alcohol. Then the Russians had vodka. So I just want to understand which alcohol was given to each.
Right.
army.
So the Germans have beer,
Okay.
and some of the units. The German army is organized a little differently than the French army. It's organized along federal lines. So each federal region of Germany recruits and trains its own units.
Okay.
So there's like Prussian units, Hanoverian units, Bavarian units, and they all have different ration schedules when they begin the war. So some units have a beer ration, many have a schnapps ration. But the problem with beer is that it's heavy, it spoils in the heat, and it freezes in the cold. So it's very hard to bring it up to the front unless you keep it in bottles. And then it's extremely heavy.
Yeah.
So
Exactly.
the Germans actually don't drink a lot of beer, at least not in the front. They do have drink schnapps, but there's another problem, which is that ethyl alcohol is a very important solvent used in the manufacture of high explosive, and there is a blockade around Germany, which means it has to rely on its indigenous alcohol production, both for munitions and to supply troops. And they make the decision to direct most of the alcohol towards munitions. So when the Germans drink, it's typically in the rear areas, in the debits who are run by French and Belgians, who are
Okay.
serving the German army rather than the French and the British.
In those areas where they was occupied, right?
That's exactly right.
Okay, understand. And then going back to what you were saying before, so the Americans came in and it was more like a whole different culture difference, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, because the American perspective, right? You had prohibition in the U.S., which happened shortly after that. So
That's exactly
it's
right.
a whole different view of wine, which is really, really interesting. And you have this old world, new world way of thinking. And it's just very interesting because in today's world, right, you have, a lot of anti-alcohol messaging coming from the lobby. But then what you were saying today about the Société Française de Temperance, the temperance movement from France at the time was like, drink wine, distilled alcohol is bad. So it was that kind of that separation where you had different types of alcohol, which was interesting. Wine was seen as healthy, invigorating. Distilled alcohol was seen as sickening or deadening, even in the advertisements. So it's just interesting to see those differences between how the U.S. approached it or the American army approached it, and here as
Yeah.
well.
In general, the temperance campaign in France in the late 19th and early 20th century is piteously weak. That the temperance advocates and reformers are looked at as un-French freaks, right? Trying to import, as one of my characters says, dangerous anti-French ideas of temperance. And so the SFT, the Société Française de Tempérance, the largest temperance organization in France, is run by and bankrolled by the wine industry.
Okay.
And its argument is we need to get people off of the distilled stuff, which is dangerous and un-French, and back onto wine, which is healthy, invigorating, and the French drink par excellence.
Which
So
to an
if
extent, in the army, culturally or spiritually, did help bring people together.
yes,
No.
no, undoubtedly
Yeah.
that's one of the things that I argue in the
But
book is
alcohol
that
is alcohol. Yeah. Yeah.
this wine ration worked. Like it really did what it was supposed to do,
Hmm.
which is bring people together, remind them of what they're fighting for,
And
create a moral community.
yeah, and even what's great about your epilogue is that you talk about after the war. And
Hmm.
wine wasn't given a negative connotation. After the war, like we talked about at the beginning, it was seen as a crucial part of the victory as well, right? Like after the war, was
Hmm.
wine respected more? Was it just okay, guys, we're back to our regular wine
No,
consumption?
no, wine. There is a very good argument to be made that France really becomes a wine drinking country when the average French person will have a bottle of wine on the table for every dinner after the First World War.
Hmm.
That it's the experience of the First World War, the role of wine in the First World War, that really embeds wine drinking in ordinary life. So in a certain sense, um, the winemaker's plan to create a generation of wine drinkers works.
Yeah.
So wine per capita wine consumption goes up after World War One to in the late 1920s, 30s, the highest point recorded in France.
Because I imagine soldiers after the war, because wine was such an emotional part of their horrific journey, maybe after the war was part of like just getting together. I don't know, maybe veterans getting together and sharing wine.
No, that is exactly right. There are very vigorous veterans organizations throughout France after the First World War, and that's what they do: is they get together, they drink their Pinot, they talk about the war.
Hmm.
So it remains a important touchstone of identity and connection even after the war and into the Second World War. As I talk about in the book, when the Second World War begins, there's another kind of wine for soldiers campaign. There's another attempt by the winemakers to get the army to adopt a ration. But if you know anything about the military history of the Second World War, you know that the French ignominiously collapsed in a matter of days.
Hmm.
So there's never actually the time for a wine ration to be
Yeah,
distributed.
exactly. They must have the logistics so well put together, and then yeah, it's not the
Yeah, and
best
then
time
it
to.
just falls apart.
Yeah.
But the opposing armies, the Germans in particular, and later the British and the Americans, adopt a different drug. They adopt amphetamine or methamphetamine
Hmm.
as the with a daily ration. So some historical work by, by two guys, Oler and Rasmussen, are the names of the two historians. Oler in particular has argued that the Blitzkrieg in 39 in Poland and in 40 in the Netherlands and in France and Belgium was essentially fueled by methamphetamine.
Hmm.
It was sold under the trade name Previtin.
Basically,
Soldiers,
a much stronger null, I guess, a much
yeah, yeah,
stronger
yeah,
shot.
yeah.
And Japanese
They
and pilots, right? Japanese pilots, the kamikaze pilots, things like that.
mhm.
It automatically became a way to control the army, I guess. Control.
No, so yeah, what happens in particular in the Japanese case where they call methamphetamine the drug to raise fighting spirits, right? Like the sense of intoxication, focus, and energy is interpreted by these pilots as like they're becoming ready to make this sacrifice for the emperor and the
Mm.
nation, right? It signals a shift, a psychological and bodily shift, to prepare them for what's to come.
Yeah.
So not only does it increase their vigilance and their energy while they're flying, but it sends a kind of bodily psychological message, a biopsychological message that this is the time for you to make your great sacrifice.
Yeah.
But one of my favorite facts about the Second World War is what the Germans call their methamphetamine. They call it tank chocolate.
That was it. Tank chocolate.
Tank
Okay.
chocolate, or Herman Goring
I, I
pills.
got I
So
got I gotta say, Tank Chocolate wins for the best nickname for whatever you're gonna take before
yeah,
battle. I
yeah,
mean,
for meth.
I prefer wine over everything, but Tank Chocolate. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to say no to some chocolate in the trenches.
Yeah, take
But
chocolate.
listen, I mean, Adam, I wanna thank you so much for your time. At the end of the day, wine was a like you do in your research. Wine was a huge part about the courage, the patriotic feelings, the nationalism, the moral community in the darkest times in history. And part of this podcast is to celebrate wine. And
Yes.
your book really gives us a reason to understand its importance in various factors. I mean, most of us are enjoying wine around a table with friends, with family. We're not enjoying wine in muddy trenches filled with rats. We're not enjoying that. But it just goes to show, I think, what why wine is important, like I said before, and how wine can be not only a feeling of teamwork, of a national identity, but also something that can make us feel good at the end of the
Yeah.
day. We're in a crazy world right now, and I think we all need reasons to feel good. So always in moderation. And thank you for writing such an excellent book. Can you tell our
Oh,
listeners where can you find this book and how can they get it?
uh, basically, quite surprisingly, for an academic book, it's available at every major online retailer. You can even get it off of
Walt.
Walmart.com. When I saw that, I almost fell out of my chair.
Oh my God. You can even get it at Walmart. You can get it on Amazon. And this isn't an academic book that's $2,000. I think I got this for $40 and it was an incredible read and it opened my mind to something I didn't know. And
Oh, well,
thank
thank you so much. That's for your kind words, for inviting me into this conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
thank you, Adam. Cheers. One more
Cheers.
time. We can't clink glasses, but we can do it virtually here. Enjoy the rest of your day and thank you for joining the Zonda Wine Podcast.